Hello, I'm going to talk about a journey I made to the mountains of East Africa, to the highest mountain on the continent, Kilimanjaro, which is getting on for 6,000 meters above sea level, Mount Kenya, and rising above the borders of Uganda and the Congo in the Ruwenzori Mountains, Mount Stanley. We're going to start on the highest mountain, Kilimanjaro. This is a picture I took comparatively recently, looking from the Selengei Conservation Area, looking south from the border of Kenya into Tanzania to Kilimanjaro, this vast extinct volcano, which is supposed to have been given by Queen Victoria to her nephew, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, when the great imperial powers were drawing lines across the continent of Africa, and a slight kink was made in the border between Kenya and Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was then known, to include Kilimanjaro in the German territory. The fact that I was going to the mountains of East Africa was all thanks to this man, Anthony Willoughby. Towards the end of 1986 I heard that this chap Willoughby had got together a group of friends, mainly from London, Hong Kong and Tokyo, and they were going to go and attempt the highest peaks in Africa. And they needed someone to give them a hand, a sort of general dog's body cook, come load carrier, come mountain guide. And the deal was I'd get a free trip and my first ever visit to the African continent. And it seemed too hard to resist, so I joined the expedition. Willoughby, for some reason, likes to travel everywhere in a pinstripe suit, and here he is on the lower slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, having enrolled me as assistant guide to the expedition. It was a group of people of fairly limited mountaineering experience, all quite fresh and green, and arriving in these sort of immaculate new clothes, and it was obvious that there's quite a sort of dearth of mountaineering experience, but huge amounts of enthusiasm. Like all these expeditions, we were entirely reliant on local people helping us get up the mountain, and here are some of the porters before we set off from the roadhead up Kilimanjaro, including the headman whose name I can't remember, but I do remember he took a great shine to Willoughby's bowler hat, which he wore, I think, all the way to the summit. Well, we set off one fine December morning, walking through the fantastic forests which completely surround Kilimanjaro, and bearing in mind that 3 days earlier I'd been walking through the dark winter streets of London on my way to the Underground to get to Heathrow, to find myself here in this wonderland was just a glorious treat. This is the famous African fire lily growing amongst the undergrowth. By about midday it was raining, as it often does happen near the equator in the afternoons, and people were looking sort of slightly less enthusiastic, slightly less well laundered by the time we reached our first overnight camp. On the second day we moved up into the zone of the giant heather trees draped in these extraordinary hanging old man's beard lichens, and it really was a wonderful fantasy landscape as we then moved up into the zone of the giant groundsel plants towards the second camp, and these wonderful gladioli just growing everywhere amongst the heather. It really was a sort of botanical paradise. And all the while, of course, our porters doing the real hard work, carrying all the tents and food and stoves and general supplies, and inevitably rejecting these pack frame rucksacks and carrying them in the local style. Well, we got to our second camp, which was at about 4,000 meters above sea level. The next day, which I think was Christmas Eve, was designated a rest and acclimatization day. And it was a pleasant, relaxed time, cooking most of the day. Here we are making some homemade donuts for lunch. And then we awoke on Christmas morning to this glorious sight, our first real view of Kilimanjaro. Now, we hadn't come up the normal route from the east, we'd come up from the west, up the Umwe route, which follows a narrow forested ridge before emerging onto this great plateau beneath the great breach wall of Kilimanjaro. Up there you can see the famous breach wall icicle, first climbed by Reinhold Messner no less back in the 1970s, rarely present these days. And the plan now was for most of the team to go round to the right to join one of the more normal, easier routes up the mountain, accompanied by the porters, while a few of us, led by Andrew Wielechowski, who's a local expert mountain guide, we were going to head up towards what's called the Western Breach and the Arrow Glacier. So on Christmas Day we made our way round to the remains of a hut. There was not much left of the hut. We pitched a couple of tents beside it, and there's Andrew Wielechowski on the right with the bare ankles, cutting out a tent platform for that night. And then there was a glorious evening, and here's Anthony Willoughby with his wife Victoria, sister-in-law Alexandra, just enjoying being in this glorious situation with the great breach wall towering above us. Our route the next day took us up the Arrow Glacier, which is that icy snow slope on the right, leading to some final rock scrambling, getting right up onto the summit plateau. I have to say that Boxing Day was one of the hardest days I've ever spent in the mountains. I acclimatized very slowly. In less than a week we were climbing from sea level to over 5,500 meters above sea level. I felt like death. I think Boxing Day night on the Furtwängler Glacier was possibly the worst night I've ever spent on a mountain. I was in the green tent, I think with 4 other people crammed into that tent. I remember I had a quite thin sleeping bag. I was quite cold. I had trouble with my breathing. I felt nauseous. I had a headache. I felt claustrophobic. It was utter purgatory. And what was particularly galling was to get up in the morning feeling like death, and to see Victoria and Alexandra, the 2 sisters, skipping around, drying out their yellow tent, absolutely, completely unaffected by the altitude. Well, we eventually packed up camp and we dragged our bodies up the final slopes to the summit of Kilimanjaro, meeting the rest of the team who had come round by one of the easier routes from the other side. I did go back to Kilimanjaro a couple of years later, and this was setting off up the normal route, up the final scree slopes at dawn. Wonderful sight, before arriving with that team. That was 1989, arriving on the final traverse round to the summit. Back in 1986, I do remember one person coming up from the other team being gently, very gently prodded towards the summit by one of the porters, saying, "Vomity, vomity, no problem." I think most of us felt pretty grim at getting on for 6,000 meters above sea level. But we made it to the summit and then dragged ourselves wearily down the mountain, down the normal route. In my case, stopping frequently to lie down and fall asleep, and to be woken by shouts, "Has anyone seen Stephen? Is he all right? Where's our guide?" And eventually we made it down to the Kibo huts on the normal route. Well, we returned to closer to sea level. We drove back to Kenya, to Nairobi, and then made our way for a day's rest and recuperation in this lovely hotel garden. It was a real treat to be spending Christmas in this way. And then led by Mark Savage, who's got our back to us and is tinkering with the engine of his Land Rover, local Nairobi mountain guide, we made our way towards Mount Kenya. You might be able to read the writing on the back of this t-shirt. We'd all been issued with these 3 Peaks t-shirts. The writing there says, "I will not complain." It was Willoughby's desire that everyone should approach this expedition in the right spirit, and if things happen to not to go entirely according to plan, there would be no grumbling. And obviously travelling in the mountains of East Africa can be tricky. This was actually, I took this picture when I came here 2 years later with my wife, and this was the same route, the same approach from Chogoria in the wet season, with the Land Rover almost disappearing into the mud. So now we started on our second peak, Mount Kenya, and this was taken, I think, on the first day coming up the wonderful Gorges Valley on the southeast side of Mount Kenya. Stunning scenery. Because some new members had joined the team who had only just arrived, and unlike us were not acclimatized because they hadn't been up Kilimanjaro, we had a rest and acclimatization day and a time to enjoy the glorious, extraordinary, weird vegetation, so typical of these African mountains. This is a giant lobelia plant, and this is what they look like when they're full grown. And apparently the reason for this design of the plant is that these leaflets, these furry leaflets, protect the flowers which nestle underneath, and those are the actual flowers of the lobelia, which once you see the flowers, they look slightly like the little lobelias that you might see in a suburban garden in Scotland. And they're much enjoyed by the rock hyraxes, which to me look a bit like a slightly overgrown guinea pig, but apparently are, according to the zoologists, are the closest living relation to the elephant, and they're a common sight scurrying amongst the rocks on these East African mountains. It was New Year's Eve, so we celebrated that evening with a splendid dinner, and one of the stipulations about not complaining was that no one would complain if a little bit extra had to be paid to hire extra porters to carry adequate quantities of wine for the expedition. So we celebrated well, and then the next morning woke to a glorious morning at this camp with the sight of the mountain above us. As you probably know, many people go to Mount Kenya, maybe some of you have been there, and many people go to a point called Lenana, but it's not actually the summit. The highest point of Mount Kenya, it actually has two high points. They're the culminating volcanic plug of this ancient extinct volcano, and they're called Nelion and the slightly higher Nbatian. And Nelion and Nbatian were the names of two chieftains, and the names were given to the mountain by this man, Sir Halford Mackinder, who came here in 1899. Mackinder was the first professor of geography. He was the founder of the geography school at Oxford University, and in the summer of 1899 he spent his entire long summer vacation travelling out by boat to Mombasa, and then travelling up with an immense army of porters up through the jungle up to Mount Kenya, and succeeded, helped by two guides from Komea, two alpine guides, in reaching the highest summit of Batian in 1899. We were hoping to repeat part of that route the following day. And that evening we arrived beneath, this is actually beneath Nelion, Willoughby staring up at the mountain, and we're looking up at the route which was initially climbed by Mackinder, and then repeated 30 years later in 1929 by a young tea planter called Eric Shipton and a local district commissioner called Percy Wynne Harris. Both Shipton and Wynne Harris, 4 years later, were on the 1933 Everest expedition. Shipton got to about 27,000 feet. Percy Wynne Harris got to over 28,000 feet above sea level, reaching a height just about 900 feet below the summit of Mount Everest, which remained an altitude record for many, many years. Well, back in 1929, Eric Shipton, who'd done a bit of climbing in Europe, really on Mount Kenya, this was the first time he pioneered a new route to a previously unclimbed summit, because Mackinder 30 years earlier had not been to the summit of Nelion, and that's what Shipton set his sights on, and they more or less followed Mackinder's original route, and then they continued up directly to the summit of Nelion, becoming the first human beings to reach that point. And it was this Shipton route which we were going to go and climb, setting off early the next morning. Well, it involved some fantastic rock climbing on magnificent granitic rock. You might wonder why we were carrying those huge rucksacks. The plan was to sleep on the summit of the mountain, so we were carrying stoves and sleeping bags and so on. And here's Willoughby coming up a pitch actually known as de Graaf's variant. Anyway, it's one of the sort of key pitches on the climb, and here's his wife Victoria enjoying, I think, her first ever rock climbing. And glorious sense of space as one climbs up the centre of this extinct volcano, seeing remnants of the volcanic rim spread around, and then the vast plains of Africa stretching into the distance. We all arrived on the summit, and here we are on the summit. Well, the select team, these were the people sort of teamed up to this rock climb, while the rest of the team were climbing Lenana across the way. I used to have a neighbour in Bradford-on-Avon called Ian Howells. Ian Howells lived in Kenya for many years in the 60s and 70s, and he made many ascents of Mount Kenya, climbing many new routes up the mountain. And he said he used to enjoy watching the sunset from the summit, but he didn't like getting cold and uncomfortable. So he decided to build himself a hut on the summit of Nelion. And I think it took him 7 or 8 journeys climbing the Shipton route up Nelion, carrying on his back prefabricated sections of an aluminium hut which he had constructed in his garden back in Nairobi, which he then assembled and bequeathed to future generations to enjoy this magnificent bivouac. It's pretty pokey, this hut, and I think we had 6 or was it 7 people crammed in there that night. It was a very claustrophobic night at 5,100 and something metres above sea level. Not my best night on a mountain, but a lot better than the night on Kilimanjaro, because now we were acclimatised and actually feeling really fit and going well. The plan was to go across the Gate of the Mists to the higher summit of Batian in the morning. Alas, we woke in the morning to thick, heavy rime hoarfrost, and Mark Savage, who was really in charge of the operation, and he was the local expert, despite my pleading, he said, this is not suitable for pretty inexperienced people. It's going to be enough of a job to get everyone safely down. So alas, we didn't go to the summit of Batian, and maybe one day I'll go back and get to the highest point of all. What we did do was adopt the Savage method of basically lowering people all the way back down the Shipton route to get us safely off the mountain. Well, the following day we made our way round to the north side of the mountain. That's a lovely peak called Point John, and then looked back up at Nelion and Batian. Nelion on the right now, Batian on the left. Between them, the Gate of the Mists, as Mackinder had named it, and the Diamond Glacier, which Mackinder had crossed with his 2 Courmayeur guides back in 1899, and descending from that glacier, Africa's most famous ice climb, the Diamond Couloir, which I believe no longer exists. We then descended a route called the Old Moses route, and if it hadn't been for Mark Savage and Andrew Wielechowski, who came up to meet us, we wouldn't have had a chance of finding our way down this route. Very thrilling to be travelling through some quite wild country, culminating in thrashing through this magnificent bamboo forest, eventually reaching the rendezvous with the Savage Land Rover and the rest of the team to take us back to Nairobi. Just to put you in the picture, we had now climbed Kilimanjaro, we climbed Mount Kenya. Incidentally, I say Mount Kenya, the origin of the name, there are various stories about it. I think the original name was Kirinyaga, and one story is that the local British colonial settlers found that too difficult to pronounce and called it Kenya, Mount Kenya, and that became the name of the country, which has now changed to Kenya. I also read somewhere that Kenya was a word which meant, it described the black and white feathers of the cock ostrich, and it was a description of the sight of the contrasting snow and dark rocks seen from a distance on this high mountain, and that was the origin of the name Kenya. Anyway, it gave the name to a whole country. So we returned from Kenya to Nairobi, and now in January 1987 we were setting off on what, to my mind, was the most exciting part of the whole trip, and that was to travel west across Uganda to Mount Stanley. Unlike the other peaks, Stanley is not an isolated volcano. Stanley is the highest point of a whole range of mountains called the Ruwenzori, which straddle the borders of Uganda and the Congo. Back in 1932, Eric Shipton and another local tea planter called Bill Tillman, at the start of a great famous climbing partnership, they drove across Uganda to climb in the Ruwenzori Mountains. And they mentioned how the roads in Uganda were some of the finest roads in Africa. Well, the same was not the case in 1987. The roads were in a terrible state. The country was in a terrible state. It was only just recovering from the murderous regimes of Idi Amin and Milton Obote and starting to put itself back together. What was really striking as a casual observation of a tourist travelling through the country was here we were, we rich Europeans on our jolly japes, driving through this country which had been through such terrible times, and witnessing the incredible resilience and cheerfulness of the local people in this wrecked country, now struggling back to life. And not many people were travelling to Uganda in those days, so we were something of a novelty, and caused quite a stir on our journey in this minibus to the roadhead beneath the Ruwenzori Mountains. As always, there was that slightly sort of uncomfortable feeling of the comfort and the ease of our lives compared to those of the local people. And here we are enjoying a final excellent picnic lunch before setting off into the Ruwenzori Mountains. It was very hard to buy much in the shops in Uganda. All the shelves were bare really, but one thing you can get is delicious fresh fruit and vegetables. Well, we set off on this occasion with the local Bakonjo people carrying loads and helping us get up into the mountains. Some mornings it was like this and the sun shone and we actually saw the mountains, and as you can see they are completely smothered in vegetation sustained by the moisture which just drifts up from the Congo. The Ruwenzori are like a giant sponge just soaking up the moisture and turning into this glorious luxuriant forest. Well, on the second day here we are crossing the Bujuku River and approaching Bigo Bog. Now I know we have splendid bogs in Scotland, but they are as nothing to Bigo Bog. This is bog on a grand scale, and the sport was to try and leap from wobbly tussock to wobbly tussock, but usually in the end you gave up and just sort of waded through the mire in between the tussocks. I'm told that these days there is now a wooden duckboard walkway across Bigo Bog, which to my mind is a bit of a shame, but it's obviously been done to try and reduce the erosion to this very precious landscape, because the Ruwenzori Mountains have now become, I believe, quite popular. Well, I was in heaven. I just loved this extraordinary landscape, and it was one of the best afternoons I've ever had in the mountains. Arriving absolutely drenched at the little hut where we stayed that night. My policy was always to have dry clothes in a firmly sealed polythene bag inside my rucksack, so whatever happened I could change into something dry in the evening. And here we are, actually on quite a nice evening, relaxing by a fire, cooking our supper before going to bed. Well, we continued on our journey in the morning and continued up into this enchanted landscape. It really is the most extraordinary place. You probably know that the classical Egyptian geographer Ptolemy referred to these mountains as the mountains of the moon. He never went to Uganda, or whatever it was called then, but he posited this theory that somewhere in the heart of Africa there were some extraordinary mountains which were the source of the River Nile, which is roughly correct. It's certainly one of the sources, and he called them the mountains of the moon, and he said there will be snow at the heart of Africa, which was also correct, although that snow is now rapidly dwindling. As ever, we were dependent on local help, and these amazing Bakonjo men can be seen here heading up Groundsel Gully, which consisted of a lethal mixture of lichenous mossy rock overlaid with vegetation and smothered in wet snow. Absolutely lethal, but it got us to the Elena huts. The men then descended rapidly to find somewhere more comfortable to stay for the next couple of nights, while we resided at the last remaining Elena hut with a couple of tents pitched outside. I was thrilled to see, leaning against the hut, an old pair of skis, and I thought, well, maybe they're Henry's skis. Henry is Henry Osmaston, with whom I'd previously climbed in the Karakoram and in Tibet. And during the 1950s and 60s, Henry Osmaston had worked in the forestry service in Uganda. And as a mountaineer, he'd spent a lot of time in the Ruwenzori Mountains. And in fact, he was a founder member of the Ski Club of Uganda. And the first Uganda Ski Championships had been held here at the Elena Hut sometime back in the 1950s. He was also a climber and a geographer, and naturally wanted to record these magnificent mountains, and with his friend Pasteur he produced the first climbing guide to the Ruwenzori Mountains, and it was this guide which was, we hoped, going to enable us to find our way to the summit the next day. Well, in fact, the next day the weather was extremely dreary. It was utterly dismal. It rained and snowed most of the day. We were lost in thick fog. Most of us were crowded rather uncomfortably into that damp little hut. But at about lunchtime, Willoughby and Victoria, his wife, appeared with lunch. They made a wonderful soup, and then for pudding they produced pineapple marinated in brandy. It really was a splendid feast, and set us up for the next day, which was summit day. The weather wasn't much better, but we didn't have any more time. There were flights to be caught home, so we just had to go. We in the dark, we slithered and scrabbled our way up those rocks to the foot of the Elena Glacier, where there was a good deal of cursing and swearing, mainly on my part, as 9 pairs of crampons were fitted to 9 pairs of boots in the dark before we staggered up the Elena Glacier. Now at this stage, Mark Savage and Andrew Wielechowski were no longer with us. There was no local expert mountaineer. It was all down to Venables, who'd never been to Uganda in his life before, to get this team to the top of Mount Stanley. And I remembered how Eric Shipton and Bill Tillman, the greatest mountain explorers of the 20th century, had been here in 1932 and had got totally lost on the Stanley Plateau. In fact, at one point had started following some footprints before they realised they'd been round in circles and were following their own footprints. So there was a good precedent for getting lost, and mid-morning I sort of called the party to halt and said, I'm really not sure we should continue because I don't really know where we're going. But this expedition had a great can-do spirit, and the Osmaston guidebook was produced, a compass was produced, and we racked our brains and we tried to work out where we might be and where we might be going, and we decided to continue. We never actually saw Mount Stanley, and I'm grateful to my friend Julian Freeman Atwood, who was here in 1986 for producing this photo. It shows the 2 highest summits of Mount Stanley. On the left, Alexandra, the Queen of Great Britain and Empress of India, named by a distant relative, the Duke of Abruzzi. You probably know the name of Abruzzi. He was a great aristocratic Italian explorer who previously had made the first ascent of Mount St. Elias in Alaska. He had led the first expedition to get quite close to the North Pole. He had led the first serious attempt on K2 in the Karakoram, and now in 1906 he organised a massive project to make first ascents of most of the major summits in the Ruwenzori Mountains, aided by 2 local guides. In fact, the same 2 Courmayeur guides who'd been on Mount Kenya with Mackinder 7 years earlier, Joseph Brocherel and César Ollier. Well, they climbed Alexandra, and they also reached the highest point, Margherita, named after Abruzzi's aunt, the Queen of Italy. I think the official route goes up to the ridge on the right there. I think that's the way you're meant to go. I don't think we went that way. I think we probably went somewhere up here, because I do remember when we hit the ridge, I was surprised to find we were almost immediately on the summit of Margherita. That picture was taken in 1986. Here's a photo taken in 2017, and suddenly those great giant ice vegetables have all disappeared. The final part of the ridge is now all bare rock. It has changed drastically. And just to show you again, there we are back in 1986. If you go back to 1906, there's even more heavy snow and ice cover. Well, here we are in January 1987, winding our way between chasms and crevasses and up through what are like sort of great giant frozen vegetables. Rather reminded me very much of the mountains of Patagonia or South Georgia in the Southern Ocean, where you get vast amounts of wet air condensing and then freezing on these cold summits and producing these fantastic formations of frozen rime. Well, we arrived on the ridge, continued a short way, and suddenly there didn't seem to be any further to go. And after having a quick check around, I ascertained that there didn't seem to be anything higher than us, and I said, well, I think we're on the summit of Margherita. Anyway, this will have to do. I'm glad to say that we found a metal pole on the summit, and afterwards, having conferred with one of the local Beconjo men, he confirmed that that metal pole was indeed on the summit of Margherita. So we had reached the highest summit of the Ruwenzori Mountains before making our way back down with a bit of an afternoon clearing and almost a bit of a view back down to the Elena huts, where I got very concerned because Didier, one of the team from Lyon, had insisted against my better wishes on going up to the summit with his father Maurice, who was in his 70s, had a heart condition and was going very, very slowly and had already been showing some sort of signs of trouble with the altitude. And thank God, eventually two little figures appeared as they made their way back down to the Elena huts, and we could continue down to the Kitandara Lakes, where we awoke the next morning to this magical scene before starting the journey back to the roadhead. From here we continued on a circuit over the Freshfield Pass, named after another Victorian explorer, from where we descended the magnificent vertical bog, eventually winding up one night at the cave of Bujongola, where the Duke of Abruzzes expedition had their expedition headquarters back in 1906. Well, settling down that evening to cook supper, I just felt total contentment. It had been a hugely enjoyable expedition. After the hideous horrors of altitude on Kilimanjaro, we were all now totally acclimatized and fit. This, to my mind, had been the most enjoyable part of the whole expedition. This was our final night in the mountains of East Africa, and we were treated to a clear night with a full moon rising over the heather forest, and we were treated to a magical clear dawn as we set off before dawn that morning to get back to the roadhead. And it was one of the most enjoyable mornings I've ever spent in the mountains. The everlasting flowers, the helichrysums, were beaded in dew, but then the sun came out and they burst into life, and everywhere there was this just extraordinary profusion of life. Back in 1906, a member of the Abruzzi expedition, Filippo de Filippi, had penned the official account of the expedition, and this is how he described this Ruwenzori forest. In this forest, trunks and boughs are entirely smothered in a thick layer of mosses, which hang like waving beards from every spray cushion and englobe every knot, curl and swell around each twig, deform every outline and obliterate every feature, till the trees are a mere mass of grotesque contortions, monstrous tumefactions of the discoloured leprous growth. No forest can be grimmer and stranger than this. Well, I'm sorry I didn't read it in the original Italian, but it sounds pretty good in translation. And it's one view of this forest. I actually found it glorious. I just loved it. But of course, it's particularly joyous on a sunny morning like that, when everything is just bursting with life. And of course, there's the whole undercarpet of the forest is just filled with these fantastic flowers and fruits and just this sense of, it's like being in the Garden of Eden as we thrashed our way down through the jungle to make our way back to the waiting minibus and head for home. Well, before leaving, there was one more job to do, and this was very nice. Willoughby, he had a really nice touch. He, in those days, was a sort of dealer in leather goods in Hong Kong, and he arrived in Africa armed with a supply of leather wallets. And at the end of each expedition, after each mountain, all the porters were given their wages in a leather wallet, and into this wallet was inserted a portrait photograph. And this was, of course, long before anyone had probably even thought about digital photography. So Willoughby came armed with a Polaroid photo, and each porter was given a Polaroid photo as a keepsake. So everyone was paid, we said our goodbyes, we then headed down to Lake Edward, down in the plains at the foot of the mountains, for a final day of rest and recuperation, enjoying our final experience of Africa before heading for home.